With Giving Tuesday right around the corner, it's important to make sure that the money we give gets to the causes that we're passionate about. In the midst of this season of giving, scammers are working to get as much of your charity as they can. Today's guests are Michael Thatcher and Zachary Weinsteiger. Michael leads Charity Navigator in its efforts to make impactful philanthropy easier for all by increasing the breadth and depth of ratings coverage of a large number of charities. He has held various board positions within the nonprofit and tech sector, holds several patents in enterprise systems management, and has a degree from Columbia University in New York. Zachary is part of Charity Navigator's analyst team and is responsible for data collection, research, analysis, and evaluation of the performance of America's largest charities. He also works towards improving the evaluation system and process. I'm your host, Chris Parker, and this is the Easy Pray podcast. Michael Thatcher, Zachary Weinsteiger, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Pray podcast today.
Thanks for having us, Chris.
We're definitely happy to be here.
Thank you. So I'd like to get you guys to give us a little background about yourselves and how you got involved with Charity Navigator.
I'll start. So I'm the president and CEO of Charity Navigator. I've been in this role for about 5 years. And prior to being with Charity Navigator, I worked at Microsoft as a CTO in their public sector, looking at trying to make a difference using technology in social and economic improvement in areas like Africa, Middle East, and Asia. And I became attracted to Charity Navigator as a means of actually affecting more good in the world and working on an evaluation system that would allow us to guide dollars to well-run and more effective nonprofits and hopefully weed out the bad players if and when they existed.
Yeah, and I'll hop in. I have a bit of a less storied history, and I kind of found myself here by accident. I had initially intended to be an educator, kind of at the college level, but during the course of study, found myself feeling like I wanted to be doing more in the world, and kind of happened upon Charity Navigator by happenstance. Their founder actually spoke at my graduation, and a friend of mine wound up working there. So I wound up here as an analyst, and over time took over our advisory system, which is what I do today.
That's awesome. So why was Charity Navigator originally created?
So Zach was just talking about Pat Dugan, and who was the founder of Charity Navigator. Pat and his wife Marion started the organization back in the early 2000s. And Pat came into a significant amount of wealth and started giving back. And as he started giving back, he realized there wasn't an independent evaluator of nonprofits. And he was familiar with Morningstar, which was a system that had been created to help people sort of figure out the best organizations to invest in. And he was seeing his giving as an investment in social change. And when he saw that there wasn't an evaluator, because he had the means, he created it. He didn't necessarily have the know-how to make that happen, but he hired the right people, built it up, and he funded Charity Navigator's existence for well over the first decade of our coming into being. And I'd say the other catalyst for Pat was, at that time, there were a couple of high-level and high-profile scandals within the nonprofit sector. There was a situation at Covenant House, there was a situation with Hale House, and then a little bit later, something with one of the United Ways in the country. And again, seeing that there was not always the best behavior in the sector, again, drove this idea of like, how do we help the donors and become a donor advocacy? Charity Navigator's evolved a fair amount since that origin. And in fact, we're no longer supported by the Dugan family. We're actually an independent 501c3 charity ourselves, living off of the donations of people who use our service.
Gotcha. How big is the charity sector domestically or internationally?
In terms of dollars, it's about $450 billion annually that goes into the sector. And there are about between 1.6 and 1.7 million nonprofits that are registered with the IRS.
Wow, that's huge.
It's been growing quickly.
That leaves a lot of room for like poorly run or ineffective charities and highly effective charities. Is it that seems like a surprisingly large number to me? Is it that there's a fairly low barrier to entry?
It's relatively easy to register as a 501c3 nonprofit. It's also one of the things that you'll realize it's a little bit like startups where you have about 80% fail within the first 5 years of existence. And so I don't know that it needs to be hard to create a charity. It is harder to run one and have it be sustainable. Often we start nonprofits or a charity when we are moved by some specific issue or cause. And then the family, usually it's family started, we'll get together and we'll create something. And sometimes that has interest that lasts and is sustainable across a generation. Sometimes it's multiple generations. You look at some of the larger foundations that have been around for several generations, you can see significant growth and benefit that have come from them. But then you have many that just disappear.
So it's kind of a lot of churn on the front end that charities within the first couple of years, either they're not able to get traction, they're not able to get donors, the people that are running it have challenges in their lives and have hard time donating or dedicating a large amount of time to it. I assume that running a charity can start consuming a considerable amount of time.
So sort of short aside on that, the first thing I did professionally was run an arts organization, and my wife and I started a 501c3 dance company. And the two of us ran that for about 10 years until we ran out of steam and ran out of money. And over that time, I was supporting myself and us by writing software, which eventually became my main point of focus. So it's been interesting for me to come back later in life and actually run a nonprofit evaluator that's all about sort of being more efficient. Because needless to say, that was it was a tough failing at that time when I was in my sort of 20s and beginning of my early 30s and having to walk away from what I really loved. Yeah,
I mean, it's efficient charities or effective charities are not highly profitable in terms of the people that are running them in most cases. It's not your private sector job where you're going to make vast sums of money. Not that anyone does, but
yeah.
So the core of what I wanted to talk about was charity scams, not necessarily charities that are not properly run or have technical challenges in the way they operate, but actual scammers who are fake entities representing themselves as a charity. What are kind of is there any indications like how much money ends up going to these fake charities?
I think I'll start on this and maybe let Zach add some color to it. But the hardest part about charity scams is that they're scams. And until they get caught, we don't know they're going on. And so you can be a fake entity that is pulling off $20 donations from thousands of people. And even if they get caught, those people that gave away their $20 to a fake organization, they may never even know that they got burned. Right? So that's one of the harder parts. And then the other is, I think it's almost psychological. When you've been burned, you don't want to admit it.
Yeah.
And so people don't always sign up to say, hey, I got ripped off.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very common thing with any type of fraud or any type of scam. I was recently interviewing someone about corporate embezzlement. And I think she was saying like only 30% of corporate embezzlement actually ever gets reported because the person who embezzled the money was a family member. They were well liked, and they don't want to come out saying, well, I'm this seasoned business person who lost, $500,000 to an employee who was, taking it out the side door. So it's definitely not something that people want to talk about.
Yeah. And I think that, particularly within the nonprofit sector and charitable giving, sometimes I think donors just never figure out that they were scammed. If you're called by some guy on the phone who spoofed a number and is telling you they're from an organization they're not, you give them your credit card information, they take some money, and you get to go about your life thinking, well, I did a good thing today, and it may never come back to you that that person wasn't actually with them. You may never seek that receipt from the original organization you thought you were supporting.
And I assume lots of people, for listeners outside the United States, when people in the United States give to charitable organizations that are registered and whatnot, that's a tax deduction that can lower the amount of taxes that they pay. So it's relevant to get that receipt. But if you're only donating $20, $30, $40, $50 to something, you might not even expect or even care whether you get a receipt.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we often find that we start to hear more and more from individuals once they actually do look for that. When they're looking for that kind of confirmation is when they start to realize something seems amiss. And we often get little kind of emails from donors, kind of expressing frustrations around this. And it's kind of one of those hard things to prove in those moments. But one of those things that, at that point, you certainly, if you feel you've been had, you certainly should be reporting it to the regulators in charge of dealing with this kind of thing.
Are there any specific warning signs people should be watching out for in terms of how they're being communicated with someone who's claiming to represent a charity?
Go ahead, Zach.
I think that, largely what you're looking for is transparency. We would always, I think, recommend that you tend on the side of wariness if you're kind of approached via phone call to give to a specific cause. Ask them for their EIN, their employer identification number. All 501c3s will have one. It's something you can then run through a database. You can find their website, and that is often the safer place to do it. You can also do it by our website in our giving basket. But if organizations are not willing to really have that, or callers rather, are not willing to have that kind of conversation with you, provide that with that information transparently. If they're trying to apply pressure to get you to give now, at that point we'd say, certainly, maybe take a step back and do a little bit of extra due diligence.
Yeah, I know. There is a particular charitable, someone who claims to be from a charitable organization. I have no idea if they're legitimate or not. Calls me on a monthly basis and says, "Hey, we're collecting for this particular cause," and I'm vaguely aware that they might be a legitimate charity, but I've never actively pursued this entity before. So I get these phone calls, and I'm like, well. Honestly, I don't give to people who, call me unsolicited because I have no idea that you are who you claim to represent. And it's like, well, I can send you literature in the mail. And I'm like, well, that doesn't really confirm it either. And so I've just, opted with if I receive an unsolicited phone call from someone who claims to be from a charity, it's like, well, I'm sorry, I already have charities that I work with. If your charity is in an area that I'm interested in, I'll likely find out about you and give to you through means that I know are legitimate. Unfortunately, phone calls is not one of them, nor emails, nor letters in the physical mail.
On that point, Chris, I think I would, as a prospective donor, I would be defensive, and also you mentioned a really key factor to be intentional in your giving, right? So let's say you care about the causes you care about are the environment, animal protection, and something around health or education. So those are your causes. And if someone comes and calls you up and says they want you to give to something that it's totally unrelated to the cause, that's something that you have an easy out, sort of saying, this is where I give. The other thing, particularly with cold calls, is ask them if they exist on Charity Navigator or on one of the other platforms. Ask them, as Zach said, ask for the EIN number. Say, hold on a second, I want to look you up. Tell me your EIN number, and then you look them up on a site like ours. We'll tell you right away. We'll also give you a rating. And if they don't exist, they won't show up in our database. And I think that's a really key thing, is you want to know that they're really a 501c3 registered charity. And you also want to stay aligned to your giving intentions. Yeah. I'd add one last thing is, and I think where we see more scams, and maybe this is a question you get to, is when there's a crisis in the world, that will change your giving philosophy, right? So we've been living through a couple really intense crises in the United States over the last year, both with COVID-19, with racial injustice. And so and people are really digging into and starting to give in areas where they may not have normally given.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that my wife and I do. We have a set number or a set group of charities that we give to on a regular basis that have, causes that we believe in, we're passionate about, and we want to support. But then there's also when natural disasters happen, we have kind of a contingent for that to be able to help out in those sort of things, because we kind of view it as we're interested in causes that help people get themselves out of situations. So if you're helping educate people and training people to have new skills, learn English, that is something that will continue to help them throughout their lifetime, help their family, help their community. But there's also at times of crises when people just need food today. It'd be nice to learn a new skill, learn a new language, but I need to eat today. I need to give my kids food today. So there's that balance that we always kind of wrestle with and go back and forth with of, are we meeting immediate pressing needs of food and shelter, or are we meeting kind of long-term goal needs to help people raise themselves up out of poverty or something like that? So do you see, how do you guys feel, or what do you guys think about GoFundMe and charities and people soliciting for support on GoFundMe and some of these, I don't know that I want to necessarily call them charity side, public facing, crowdsourced funding for people in need, let's say.
So it's crowdfunding, and I'd love for Zach to speak a little bit about, we have a relationship with GoFundMe. And I think as an organization, they're a strong organization. The challenge with what we call like personal fundraising through a crowdfunding site, be it GoFundMe or another, is if you don't know the person and you don't have a real relationship with that person, that it's literally a person we're talking about, not a registered organization with the IRS that you actually have some form of accountability structure with. If you don't know them, you're taking some significant risk. That said, the platform itself, and Zach, maybe you can talk about how we supply data to GoFundMe, but they work really hard to make sure that there isn't bad behavior on their site.
Yeah, kind of as background to our advisory system, what I do and what we kind of provide as an organization, even supplementing our ratings, is these advisories, these kind of little flags to let you know when there's alleged misconduct, when there is a scam that we become aware of, a fake entity kind of out in the world. What we do with our data partners, including GoFundMe, is, on a weekly basis, as these things update, as they're published, all of that, we send them that data list and they ingest on their end, their kind of idea being that they want to make sure that their platform is not being used for, outright scams to raise money. But what I do hear kind of the most often from users who are, again, reaching out because they feel they've been scammed is these individual kind of fundraising attempts for, here's an individual in the community who has faced some sort of tragedy. I wanted to give money, I felt good about it, but now I passed by their house and I saw a portion of their driveway and I'm worried that they just used the money for, things that weren't that. And regrettably, there's really nothing we can do about that. There's, as Michael said, very little kind of accountability structure in place for that. So again, if you want to give to a cause per se, we definitely recommend look for a registered 501c3 nonprofit. Look for one that has a strong track record with, ratings through us, through others, just kind of those little trust indicators, and give there. And if you want to give to an individual's campaign on one of the crowdfunding platforms, I'd err on the side of make sure it's someone you really know and trust, but there is going to be more implicit risk there. Yeah.
In Southern California, it was about 2 years ago, there was a well covered in the news story of a woman who had claimed that her husband had been a firefighter and she had all these health challenges and ended up raising a significant amount of money on, I don't know that it was GoFundMe, on one of the crowdfunding sites. Mm-hmm. And, as more and more people started to get to give, the news and reporters started to do more and more digging and found out that her whole story was fabricated. None of it there wasn't a single, word of this story that was true. And, people had given, I think, like $100,000 to this woman. And again, maybe it was, someone drove by and saw the portion of the driveway. So I've always been really leery about, when people are saying, "Oh, here's this GoFundMe campaign that's being covered on the news," I'm like, "Well, I don't know who this person is. I'll give where I know."
Chris, there are a couple of organizations that provide that filter that allows you to give to an entity, an individual, but do so through a nonprofit. So I'm thinking of two organizations. One is Give Directly, which is really about providing funds directly to a recipient, but it's handled by that nonprofit, and this could be anywhere in the world. And then the other, closer to home, is Donors Choose, which is more in the education space, where a teacher will run a crowdfunding campaign and then donors for, let's say, pencils and paper for their students for some specific project. And Donors Choose will then go and provide the pencils and paper to the teacher. There's no money being transacted directly to the teacher, and it actually, it's going where they say it's going. And it's so it gives you that filter or layer sometimes that's in between. So
it's nice because it allows you to give to a specific individual or a very small cause, but you're not giving them cash. So you're kind of reducing the risk of, someone's not going to hopefully someone's not going to commit a scam to get 100 pencils.
But even then, that's all they get.
Yes.
And the last point on this, though, is that when you give to a Donors Choose or a Give Directly or one of the, you have the potential of getting the tax write-off if you're in the United States. You give to an individual, you won't have that advantage.
Yeah, that's a good way to get money to an individual, but also get the tax deduction. So earlier you talked about ratings. And that's kind of the core, one of the cores of what Charity Navigator does. What are some of the signs of kind of maybe a lower rated or a less efficient charity?
So I'll start. I mean, I think one of the key things that we look for at Charity Navigator is one sort of strong financial performance, in the sense that we want to know that a significant amount of the funding is going to the primary program and what the mission is of that nonprofit. We want donors to know that they'll be around in a year or so. So in other words, do they have reserves? What's their liabilities to assets? And then the other thing that I think is really important is the levels of transparency and governance. And so if you ask them a question, can they answer it? Or are they going to avoid that? And I mean, that's at the simplest level. But then do they have processes in place, like a whistleblower policy? Do they have a privacy policy that'll protect your privacy so that you can give to them and then not necessarily have your name sold off to other organizations? Those are some of the key areas that we look for. Would you add anything to that, Zach?
No, I think that's a good starting point. I think that, of course, we do want to see that, the majority of the funding going in is going to go out to their programs. But we do also want to make clear that, overhead isn't per se a bad thing. Mm-hmm. And, I think we often see donors who, very much have the best intentions. They want their money to go to the cause, the mission, all of this. And so they see that, the CEO is making a certain salary. And suddenly they say, well, I wanted 100% of this to go there. And that's not quite realistic. But I think that organizationally, we do take a pretty strong stance on there is a relatively good amount to be spending on program and a good, healthy amount to be spending on administrative or fundraising and making clear that those things are not, kind of mutually exclusive in terms of, well, if they're giving money, if they have money here in their expenditures, that means they're not doing a certain other thing they should be doing. So kind of making clear that those overhead things also weigh into our system. And we also do have thresholds for what is good here, on a cause by cause basis.
Is there kind of a general threshold where it moves from lower rated to higher rated? Let's say if it's, I'm going to make up a number, 50% of the giving actually goes to the cause and 50% handles overhead and salaries. Kind of does that blend move, or depending on the size of the entity, or is it something that's kind of fixed?
It's right now, so for example, we've just launched a new version of our rating system, and we've set the bar at 70%, which is relatively, and that's based on doing a statistical analysis of about 200,000 nonprofits and looking at what the average behavior is, and that there was more than 85% were above 70% in terms of how much was going towards the actual program. Mm-hmm. We also so that basically says you're okay, and we're also trying to not say that 99% is necessarily the right number to be an effective nonprofit. It makes you a highly efficient nonprofit, but not necessarily effective. On the flip side, though, if you put less than 50% of your funding into overhead, you fail at that point. And so that's a failing grade. And just one point of clarification, though, on something you said, which is salaries may or may not be considered overhead.
Okay.
Because if you're paying people for program delivery, mm-hmm. that's a program expense.
Okay.
Your HR director and the executive admin, that's an administrative expense, and their salaries are admin. But those that are working on program, that expense is very much a program expense.
And that should be it. It takes time, money, and effort, and people to administer programs. So thank you for that clarity.
Yeah. No, and to that point, again, I think that for our newer system, that 70% threshold is very good as a general barometer. And again, if you are spending less than 50% of what you're spending on your program, we would generally see that as a negative trend line and something to be concerned about. With our traditional star ratings, I just want to kind of dig in a little bit and say, cause by cause, when if you're in if you're a food pantry versus a museum, you're going to have a different threshold for what is, say, an appropriate amount to spend on program. For example, museums, because they're maintaining these huge buildings, typically the larger ones at least, they, by their very nature, have more costs that are typically kind of put into the administrative bucket. Mm-hmm. And so our star rating system is responsive to that. If we know you're a museum, we know that those thresholds will be different for you than they will, again, for that food pantry. So we do try to approach this with as much nuance as we can and where we can. And, it's an ever evolving process on our end.
And I assume, that makes sense that as you guys, as Charity Navigator is in the space longer, you learn the nuances and have a better understanding. You have the analytics of what's normal for a charity within a specific sector or a specific cause. And it's nice to know that your platform adapts and doesn't, you're a 3-person charity versus a 10,000 person charity. You're gonna function significantly different.
Yeah, you really, there is no one size fits all that really works in this space. And even, when we get to something like looking at the effectiveness or the impact of these organizations, what's the impact of a symphony orchestra versus a homeless shelter, right? They're not the same.
Yeah.
We may, at the end of the day, we're gonna come up with an evaluation that gives you a number that says, in this particular space, in the area of, let's say, homelessness and homeless shelters, this is a better run and perhaps more effective organization. But we would never do the cross comparison because that would just be damaging at best, right?
So maybe this is a little tangential. So are you finding that you're needing more and more staff for Charity Navigator to have understandings of how specific sectors of charities work and what's normal within that sector? Or can your team just as a whole kind of see these trends and it's easier to see them just because you're in the overall charity as a whole?
It's a great question. And I think when you think about Charity Navigator, we're the largest independent evaluator in the country. We've been around for 20 years. We're sort of the go-to for that. And today we have 26 people working in the organization. So we're a very small nonprofit ourselves. The way we're attaining scale is through one, data analysis of common data sets. So the IRS Form 990, which all nonprofits over 50,000 are filing. But then the other area, when you start breaking into, let's say, arts and culture, museums and zoos, museums, zoos and aquariums, you have all these different segments. It's actually about working with collectives within those segments. So where we partner in, we have established significant relationships with other organizations that collect data and that are doing some analysis, because we're not capable of actually becoming experts in each and every one of these areas. Rather, we're an aggregator of expertise that we qualify that the expertise exists, and then we bring that into what becomes our rating.
No, that's helpful, because I was thinking that's got to be, otherwise it would be heavily staffed. We have one person who's an expert in animal charities, one person who's an expert in educational charities. It's like, this is going to get staff heavy very quickly if that's the case.
There is actually, and Zach, you can speak to this. There is an assignment of causes per analyst within the organization. So that's done to a certain extent, but it's in aggregate.
Yeah, no, definitely within our analyst team, which I was formerly a member of. While I was on the team, my main areas of interest and the places I personally evaluated and oversaw that process was museums. It was arts, cultures, humanities, religious activities, organizations. Those were the places that I kind of gained a vast amount of kind of insight into just through the process of evaluating, 990 after 990 after 990, all within the same space. And our analyst team is really great. It's a small team. It's a mighty team. They're great at what they do. And oftentimes, just in team meetings, someone will come up and say, hey, I've noticed this new trend, just by, again, more and more 990s being done. I've noticed this is shifting. We should look into how we can address this. And that's again, a constant process, and a process that's been ongoing since we started, which I think is kind of one of the great strengths of what we do here.
That's great that you can see trends and adapt the platform to that, and adapt the way you look at things through that new information.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, he's reading the Matrix.
Humans are very good at seeing trends in data sets. It's very interesting to me.
And anomalies, actually. I think that's the part that I get excited about. Is like when everything looks the same, you spot the anomaly, and then that's where your mind goes, which is, yeah.
That's the joy.
I have my background in IT, and I had built a fraud system for a company that I was working for, and that's exactly what it was. So that I would just be scrolling through data. Oh, hey, that's odd. Let me look at that. Data. Oh, that's odd. Let me look at that. And it was the anomalies that really stood out as, that's an outlier. Let me look at that and see what's going on there. And sometimes when data sets were too uniform, that itself was a concern.
Well, that's actually, so for example, I think one of the things that we issue advisories on is when certain costs suddenly vanish. And it's not right, there are two areas. I think, Zach, why don't you take this one on the sort of the, both some of the costs that go away inappropriately.
Yeah. So one of the things we see most frequently, and something we've tried to address through our advisory system for the organizations we star rate, because that is a rigorous process, is if we've been evaluating you, it's because you meet our criteria for evaluation, and that is historically required that you're spending something into your fundraising, because we want to know that you're soliciting from the public. So we evaluate you for, years on end, multiple years worth of data. And one year we get the 990 and suddenly it says $0 on the fundraising line. That typically doesn't make sense. We look at that and we say, that can't be right. And we don't want to make an evaluation based on that because obviously we think that might be misleading. So, our analyst team, again, great at what they do. They try, as best they can to reach out to the organization, get some clarification, see if maybe it was just, an oversight from their accountant, see if, they intend to correct it. If we don't hear back from them, if we can't really get that kind of clarity, at that point, just so our users are aware, they might know we evaluated the organization in the past. We want them to know, hey, we're not doing that for the new 990. Here's why, and we will put an advisory on that. And there's other, kind of edge cases where, we find something so kind of egregiously aberrant about the way the 990 is. Either the numbers aren't adding up in a way that makes any sort of sense. We can address that through our system again and just kind of let people know, hey, we evaluated this organization, but we found this, and you should be aware that because of XYZ data credibility issues, we simply can't at this moment, in good conscience, give you an evaluation.
Would that include? I assume with all rating systems, there's always somebody out there that's trying to game the rating system. Do you occasionally see more fringe, let's call it, charities cook the books in a way that would result in a better rating from you guys?
So kind of because we use the Form 990 as the basis for our evaluations, it's a little bit harder to do. It's actually why we find it to be a strength of the document that we choose to use, is that, it is uniform. There are rules around how it should work. And if you're cooking the books or lying on it, you're lying to the IRS, which is a bigger issue than lying to us.
I was wondering if that would be the answer. It's like, it's not that they're lying to Charity Navigator, is that they would have to lie to the IRS, and that has much more significant consequences than a better rating might get them. Yeah,
the IRS can do more to them than we can,
There's one area where, and it doesn't result in an advisory, it results in an impact on the actual rating. The score will go down, and it's something, this is getting a little bit into the weeds, but it's something called joint cost allocations. And so, for example, let's say you're an advocacy organization and part of your mission is to raise awareness about something, some issue. If you can also be sending paper mail, having advertising that is raising awareness. Within that, you can be embedding a solicitation asking for money. Depending on how you book that, you can book that. You should be booking that in a very specific way, which is it's a joint cost, right? Part of the cost is attributed as program spend, part of the cost as fundraising. Sometimes that gets ambiguated in the favor of program spend. And so that's something where we actually will pull out that amount from the rating. And needless to say, it's not something that's made us particularly popular with certain organizations, but we feel it gives a better representation of the real costs of the organization.
Yeah, and we, again, it's one of the things we also do treat with nuance. There are organizations that we also know in certain cost areas, they're going to have joint costs. PBS, every time you watch their channel, there's that little commercial every so often that says, funded by viewers like you, thank you, and maybe telling you where you can give money to. That's a joint cost. Mm-hmm. They're doing their program by having the programming, and they've embedded an ask. We know an organization like PBS or your local radio station is going to do that. And for those cause areas, there's just kind of an exemption on that policy. Generally, the rule is if it seems like something that donors wouldn't be aware of, we find that they want that information to be, available, and they typically want to see it backed out. But if you are very clear, very transparent with your donors that you are doing awareness campaigns and, all this is happening, at that point, we would do an exemption. So we try to treat it with nuance too, because there are valid uses of that.
Mm-hmm. You just don't want it to be manipulated purely for...
Exactly. We're looking for transparency in most things. As long as it's transparent, we tend to, give a little bit of leeway.
Gotcha. So I know, at least in my mind, as we're recording this, it's in mid-November, and charitable giving seems in my mind to tick up towards the end of the year as people are kind of, calculating out how much can I give, what's my tax benefits, or how did I do financially this year? There seems to be an increase in giving during the year. Do you find that that's more of is there more demand on charities in the end of the year, or is it just kind of where everyone spends a portion of their fundraising opportunity?
So I think the the driver has been probably two things. One, the spirit of, the end of year holidays, which are about exchanging gifts and giving in general. And then the other is it's about getting your tax write-off while you can, because of the calendar year end. And so in terms of our specific traffic and what happens at Charity Navigator, the busiest day of the year for us, and it goes right until midnight in Hawaii, is December 31st. So needless to say, it's not great to be a Charity Navigator employee between Christmas and New Year's.
That's your crunch time.
It really is our crunch time. And it's amazing. And it's crunch in the sense of that's when everybody's giving. That's when nonprofits are really on edge about their ratings because they need to be showing a best face to their donors. And then it's also when donors are saying, hey, my gift didn't go, it didn't go through. I've got to get this in by midnight. So it's so I think it's the tax incentive and then just the fact that it's a period where we tend to exchange gifts with each other as human beings.
Yeah, that makes sense. It triggers in my mind, having had so many conversations about scams, that there's usually several elements of scam. There's urgency, which ties in with the end of the year. There's emotion, which ties in with gift giving and exchanging gifts and being thankful, and so that almost makes it a very ripe time for scams to happen, because those elements are in there that people are rushing to try to do something, and maybe they're not in the most clear state.
Definitely. And I mean, to stay with the emotionality a little bit, there's this sense of, you're exchanging gifts, and think of all these people that don't have, right? And so we are naturally drawn to that. We want to care for people. We're giving gifts to our family, to our children, and there are going to be many children out there in different parts of the world that aren't going to be receiving anything and may actually just be needing food and water. And so that's a reality of the world that we live in. And there's something particularly abhorrent to exploiting that to steal, versus you're essentially stealing from the goodwill and the good hearts of others versus, I don't know. I have a particular issue with that, just because it seems like it's worse than just, stealing from, if you were to rob me in the street, that's different than taking my money when I was actually thinking I was going to make someone else's life better. There's a twist in that that's really hard to digest.
I think there's a double offense to it. Not only have you taken my money, you've now taken money also from someone who was even in more need of it than I was.
Exactly.
And so it's adding insult to injury, I guess.
Yep.
So if people are wanting to give to a charity and wanting to make sure that the money is going to the actual charity as opposed to maybe mistaken charity or a scam, do you guys have a system in place to help with that?
We do. And about 5 years ago, we created something called a giving basket, which allows you to give directly from within charitynavigator.org to the nonprofit that you found in our system. And one of the nice things and the conveniences is that you actually can't give to the wrong charity or a fake charity through our giving basket. And there's essentially two factors of authentication. One is Charity Navigator, and then the back-end provider, which is Network for Good. Neither of us will allow you to process a transaction that's not going to a legitimate 501c3 organization. So it's a really safe way of actually making your donation.
That's great. We'll make sure to mention that in the show notes and direct everyone to be able to give from there. So as we wrap up here, if people want to learn more about Charity Navigator, can they follow you guys on social media? Let's tell them what the website is and what their best course of action is if they have funds that they want to donate to charity before the end of the year.
Sure. So easiest place to find all and everything about Charity Navigator is simply charitynavigator.org. You'll find us on Facebook. You'll find us on Twitter. You'll find us on Instagram. Generally, it's Charity Nav would be the handle. The other, when you're getting ready to give, be clear on your causes. I think sometimes that's easier than you realize because, as I heard just recently, we don't pick causes, they pick us. And so you generally know where your heart's kind of been called. And then before you sort of move too quickly in your giving, do a little bit of research. Slow yourself down by 2 minutes by sort of searching on a platform like Charity Navigator. Know that it's a legitimate 501c3 charity, so you'll get the tax break. If it has a rating, take a look at that rating. And one thing to note with the ratings, if it's a good rating, then you can feel great about your gift. If it's an okay rating, dig into it. Ask some questions, because you may still think it's a good organization and you may want to put your money there. And then I think the real key is think of your giving as an investment and follow the money, right? So stay connected to the nonprofits that you give money to, because you're investing in the changes that they're bringing about in the world. And that will really make a difference, because you'll also become a regular donor to that nonprofit, and then you build a relationship. And in many respects, it'll be a more meaningful experience for you.
Yeah, there's something significant about not just writing a check or entering a credit card number, but seeing the results it actually has in people's lives.
Yeah, that's your return on investment, right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Michael, Zachary, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Pray podcast today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. This was fun.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Easy Pray podcast. If you like this episode, help support the podcast and our mission by leaving a review at easypray.com/review. Notes and a transcript of this episode with Michael Thatcher and Zachary Weinsteiger can be found at easypray.com/39.